welcome to this podcast version today. This is called The Decimation of Florida's Indigenous Peoples as a Result of European Invasion. In 1513, when the Spanish Conquistador Juan Ponce de León landed in Florida, the indigenous peoples were organized into around 200 tribes, with the population estimated at 350,000 people. Ancestors of Florida's native peoples had lived in the region for more than 14,000 years. Only 250 years after Ponce de León stepped foot in Florida, almost all of its original indigenous peoples and tribes were gone. This podcast will explore how such a widespread demographic catastrophe occurred in Florida in such a short period of time. Our guest today is Jerald T. Milanich. Jerald is an American anthropologist and archaeologist specializing in Florida's Native American culture and holds a Ph.D. in anthropology from the University of Florida. He is the Curator Emeritus of Archaeology at the Florida Museum of Natural History at the University of Florida in Gainesville, Adjunct Professor, Department of Anthropology, College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Florida, and Adjunct Professor, Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Florida. He has authored 27 books and published multiple articles and also edited 3 different book series. His research interests include Eastern United States archaeology, pre-Columbian Southeastern United States Native peoples, and colonial period Native American European Anglo relations in the Americas. Welcome, Jerald. Appreciate you being here.
Glad to be here. I like your scenery.
Yeah, it's definitely a Florida swamp scene in the background there. Discussion point number 1 here: epidemics, diseases such as chickenpox, influenza, measles, plague, scarlet fever, smallpox, tuberculosis, and typhoid killed tens of thousands of Florida's indigenous peoples following the contact with Europeans. Enslavement, forced labor, and warfare were also instrumental in horrific annihilation of the Indian societies and peoples. So the question to you, Jerald, discuss the major factors that you believe led to the decimation of Florida's indigenous peoples.
Well, you touched right on them. One, of course, is diseases introduced from the Old World, probably both Africa and certainly Europe. And the Indians, the indigenous peoples of Florida, simply did not have immunities. And after the initial I call it invasion by Europeans in Florida, there were some horrendous epidemics, probably somewhat localized, but there may also have been some pandemics that swept through all of Florida. We don't really know. But those diseases took a toll, and beginning in about 1610, there were several horrendous epidemics going on in North Florida, especially in the Timucua area of northern peninsula Florida. And it just took a horrific toll on the indigenous people and simply brought immense changes.
Okay, yes. I read a lot about the epidemics, and it wasn't really localized in Florida. It was all throughout the Americas, from what I understand, especially in South America as well. Discussion point number 2. In the 1680s, the Camino Real, the Royal Highway, and other trails first used by the Florida Indians, as well as rivers like the Suwannee and Santa Fe, were used to connect the Spanish missions in northern Florida with one another and with St. Augustine. The network of Catholic missions was in existence for nearly 200 years, a period in which more than 150 missions were established in Florida and southern and coastal Georgia. Question number 2 to Jerald: do you believe Spanish missions helped lead to the decimation of Florida's indigenous peoples?
Yeah, it's quite a paradox, and it's very ironic. On the one hand, the reason we know so much about the the indigenous peoples during the colonial period, is because Spaniards were there to record information and to describe what they saw and so forth. But it was the very presence of those Europeans that brought the disease to the Indians. The mission trails that you mentioned, like the Camino Royal, the Royal Road, that extended from St. Augustine west across Florida to what's now Tallahassee, and actually kept going all the way out into the southwest, was an Indian trail, probably from early times. But it was one of the main ways for the mission Indians to reach St. Augustine and to provide labor for the colonists there. What would happen is that the authorities in St. Augustine would go out and meet with the chiefs of various tribes and villages and say, okay, we have a labor draft here. We want 16 of your adult males to show up in St. Augustine. They'd go and they would bring these people over. Some of them would travel partway by canoe. Most of them would walk from about the Santa Fe River in Florida across to St. Augustine. That's a good walk. And in St. Augustine, they would be in contact with diseases like measles and so forth that you mentioned. And then they would travel back the route to their villages and take the diseases back. And there were, in about 1647, there were some horrendous epidemics at the missions. About 1657, another one. And by about 1660, did I say 15 something? 1660, the mission populations were really reduced by probably about 75 to 80%. And in another 30 or 40 years, they were down to, 95% loss. It was a horrendous thing that happened. And that's one of the reasons why we don't see Timucua Indians in Florida today. But we do have other Indians that moved in following the demise of the missions.
Yes. I guess namely what we would consider the Seminoles today, conglomeration of different Indian tribes wound up here in Florida. Discussion point number 3, the destruction of the Appalachian Indian missions in Northwest Florida and the massacre of hundreds, perhaps thousands of Indians, now known as the Appalachian Massacre, took place between 1702 and 1709. They were the victims of attacks by English colonial militia and Indian allies sent southward by James Moore, who was the governor of the Carolinian province at the time. The raids destroyed most of the Appalachian Spanish missions, as well as some of the Timucuan Indian missions to the east. Hundreds of mission Indians were taken back and sold as slaves to work on Carolinian plantations and also plantations into the West Indies. Question number 3 to Jerald. How significant of an event was the Appalachian Massacre related to the decimation of Florida's indigenous peoples?
The Appalachian Indians who lived in what is now Leon and Jefferson counties were a relatively dense population. They were what we call Mississippian culture peoples in Florida. They built big mounds like at Lake Jackson. They had a much denser population, in fact, about 4 times as dense as the Timucua to the east. And so there was more of them were surviving, and there were probably about 50,000 by the time missions were established there. And probably as many as 7,000 or 8,000 still left when James Moore, no, is that his name, Moore? Yeah, led the raids from the Carolina, from Savannah. It was, handfuls of Carolinian militia, but also Indian allies. And they just systematically wiped up one Appalachian mission after the other, skinned people alive, burned people at the stake. It was horrific. And it became very clear to the Appalachian that because some of these raiders had firearms and the Appalachian didn't, they stood little chance. And so many of them simply, said, okay, we give up, and agreed to go back with the Carolinians and their Indian allies. Others were simply killed, huge numbers. And that was pretty much the end of the mission system in Peninsula Florida.
Okay, thanks for that information. I didn't realize that that was the kind of like the catalyst to the destruction of the missions. Discussion point number 4. By the early 1760s, the surviving mission Indians, a small number compared to the indigenous population in the early 1600s, lived in refugee mission villages near St. Augustine. When the Spanish ceded the Florida province to the English in 1763, there were only about 100 indigenous peoples left. Most were taken to Cuba and resettled there. Some of the mission Indians in the Pensacola area were actually taken to Mexico. Others sought refuge near French Mobile. Later, they moved into what is today Louisiana, where their descendants actually still live today. Others of the Florida Indians likely merged with other tribes like the Yosemite and the Creeks, who were moving south into Florida at the time, and they were often raiding the few surviving Indian settlements in the peninsular Florida as far south as Key West. Question 4 to Jerald. Do you believe that any of the languages or cultures survive today from Florida's original indigenous peoples?
Unfortunately not. Some of the Appalachian words are known to the Appalachian Indians who live in Louisiana. In the 19th, or maybe it was early 20th century, an anthropologist from the Smithsonian Institution was in Alabama and found people that he thought were probably Timucua Indians who had fled there, and collected some word list and that from them. But today, we just don't have any of the language. We do have, however, and this is one of the great stories of recent research in Florida, is the friars beginning in about 1614 and on for a few years after that, translated volumes of Catholic Church doctrine into Timucua Indian language. And a linguist, Aaron Broadwell, who's now at the University of Florida, did magic. They now have computer programs that allow you scan in the pages of these books that were written in 1614, 1618. One page is going to be in Timucua, one page in Spanish. They can start teasing out the words and building a dictionary. They have thousands of words of Timucua now. It is one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. So the Timucua language, once that we all thought was long gone, is coming back to life. And there are no native speakers. I'm sure that among the Miccosukee and Seminole Indians in Florida, there are probably some words that came from Timucua or Calusa, the Indians of Southwest Florida, or Appalachia. And in a sense, those pre-Columbian and colonial period peoples live on. They're the ancestors of the Seminole and Miccosukee, as are Creek and Yamasee and other Indians you mentioned. So we haven't run out of Florida Indians. Things just change. And it's just like today at various times that you've studied in the 19th century and 20th century, people have migrated from the north or from the south to the north to find work, and then they turn around and come back to find good weather. But things change through time, and that's what happened with the Florida Indians. I find it just, we're here because they're not. And so I think it's good for people today to work with the Seminole and Miccosukee to learn about their past and help us learn about the pre-Columbian peoples in Florida.
Yeah, that's great. I guess you could kind of like equate that kind of like to the Rosetta Stone almost, right? Where we had languages interpreted thousands of years ago, and then we used that to decipher hieroglyphics and whatnot.
I never thought of that, but boy, that's kind of true. But it's now, with about 3 years ago, a previously unknown book written by Father Pareja, aided by the Timucua Indians, who was at the mission of San Juan del Puerto, which is on Fort George Island. But he wrote, we know of the books, we have the titles, but we don't have all the books. But one of them that previously had never been found was found in a library in Europe. and has now been studied, and the words in it have been added to this, to our understanding of the Timucua language.
Oh, that's wonderful. Do you think the linguistics, the sound of the language is possible, or just kind of like the interpretation into English?
Well, we have other Southeastern Indian languages and people that speak them, so that would be a good clue about how things were spoken and the accent and that. If you go online and search Timucua dictionary, you'll find an online Timucua dictionary. It's just, I'm fascinated with it. I wish I had it 20 years ago. I used to get calls from congressmen who would want to know how to say clean water in the Timucua Indian language, so they could attach it to a bill that was going to be, submitted to the legislature.
Right. Well, discussion point number 5 kind of like winds down where we're at here. Some mainstream writing that I know of, and I read a lot, says that all Florida's original indigenous peoples are now extinct. So the question to you is, how do you explain the difference between people being assimilated into other tribes and losing their original culture versus the idea of an entire tribal extinction?
Well, what became extinct or changed a great deal was the political and social and religious organization of these people. They were, the friars came in and tried to turn them into Catholics, and actually did. A lot of the people, as you mentioned, fled west. Right when that Appalachian massacre took place, a lot of the Appalachians simply took off either downstate or out to the west, as did the Timucua in that. And so just as if we look at our ancestors, I don't know, I have some from the Ukraine and some from England and France. If we look at that and then look at me today, and we're not a lot alike, but things change. Cultures continually changed. And extinction is a word we used to use, but they're not really extinct. They're just became something else. They've joined other groups, and I know that the Seminole Indians have a song that was recorded, I think, in the 1930s that was supposed to have been related to or picked up from Calusa Indians. So that when the Seminole moved into South Florida in the 19th century, it's quite likely that there were Calusa Indians who were never really missionized, although the Spaniards tried a couple times. But they probably adopted some of the Calusa Indians into their tribes, into their bands, we called them at the time. But it's just it's a phenomenal thing, and it is complex. It's not just that people stopped; it's that they became something new, just like we're doing today. We move south from Ohio or whatever, and things change. And if you look at the United States in 1776, and I can't do the math real fast, but 2024, things are very different. And that's what happened with the indigenous peoples. They change over time and do what they feel they have to do to survive.
Yes, I absolutely believe that 100%. When it comes to the end of our official discussion points, is there anything that you might want to add related to the decimation of Florida's indigenous peoples?
30 years ago, this wasn't talked about, and a lot of the history about the missions was not known, and it's because of research by archaeologists and historians and writers and people that do podcasts that this information is brought to the public, and they can learn about what went on in Florida before we all moved down here. And thank you for doing this. It's a great thing. Your research and your books are terrific.
Yeah, I want to continue moving on, getting into some additional historical episodes in Florida and elsewhere. And one of the things I'd like to add that just brought to my mind was when I first moved to the eastern part of Florida, a lot of the plantation ruins in the area were misidentified as Spanish missions. And a lot of the writings you see back in the 50s and 60s state that. Today we know darn well that, especially south of St. Augustine, there weren't any Spanish missions.
That's right. The sugar plantations and other plantations, some guy wrote a nice little book about them back in, I don't know, 1920s or something. The Florida Park Service had an archaeology division back in the, I think probably started in the 30s, but certainly in the 40s up to about 1952. And the head archaeologist, John Griffin, who later was very involved with the development of St. Augustine as a historical area and so forth. But John was thoroughly outraged that people would say that, and put up signs, in fact, that said, you know, here was a Spanish mission, when what they had was a tabby structure. And so he went around the state and gave one talk after the other to help people to see the error of their ways. But that happens, and we're always learning more. It's a lot of fun learning new things, and we're gathering more information. And when I look back at what we knew when I started out as a student in 1960s and what we know today, boy, I wish I'd be around in 60 more years or whatever it was to see what they'll find out by then.
Right. I mean, I'm just absolutely fascinated with things like LiDAR technology now, and the way that can come into an area and scope out archaeological finds in a matter of minutes compared to what it would have taken maybe years or decades.
That's right. There's an organization now that's online. In fact, I belong to it. You can just do search for LiDAR and you'll find it. And you can spend the rest of your life looking at other people's maps. But what I want to do when I get some time is to find Fort Caroline, the French fort that was built in 1564. I think we know that a later Spanish fort was built on top of it right away. And I think that the other Spanish fort that was built about 100 years later probably was built atop the same. The Spaniards was built atop the latest one. And I think that has been found by excavations done probably in the late 80s. I went over and visited, and sure, somebody had the corner of a fort. It's in somebody's front yard. They wouldn't. But with LiDAR, perhaps we can see it. I used some early LiDAR to look, and I couldn't see anything, but I didn't know what I was doing. But now, boy, whole organizations are on it, and they're doing fantastic research.
Yeah, it's incredible. I just can't believe some of, especially, I pay attention to Central and South America.
Oh, yeah.
Boy, the stuff they're finding down there today. The Spanish missions had missionaries had talked about these great population centers, you know, and then years later when the conquistadors moved in, they didn't see anybody. They didn't see these great places, you know, and they thought they were imagining things. Now with LiDAR, you can really see where there was huge population centers that probably were wiped out by pandemics in the early days of Spanish invasion.
The Amazon forest in Brazil and to the west, that's what's happened. LiDAR. First archaeologists were in there, and then as LiDAR came around, they have discovered incredible roadways, villages, a huge population. And it may be that a lot of the Amazon forest came to be after the native peoples, you know, were decimated and left the area. The Tupinamba and other Indians. It's a fascinating story, but I love looking at those. It's funny, I was just yesterday looking at LiDAR images in Brazil of a new big site they found. And they also found, while you're researching Brazil archaeology, is a long rock outcropping that goes, I think, for several kilometers with prehistoric animals and people featured on it, painted on these rocks. Oh boy, I saw this. I just thought, wow, what spectacular things were going on in the past.
Yeah, people don't realize how intelligent our ancestors were and how detail-oriented a lot of them were as well. But Hey, anyways, really thank you for coming on board. I've got some ideas for some future podcasts if you'd be interested. And again, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Aaron Broadwell, University of Florida. He's a great guy too. And that would be a wonderful podcast. You'll have everybody learning Timucua.
Yeah, I'll look into that.
Take care, Randy. Thank you for having me on. Tell your family hello.
All right. Thank you very much. You take care. I'll see you soon and get better.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Take care.